Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this new Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue, a series of events that we have launched before the adoption 2 years ago of a historic resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues, making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution in Geneva and beyond, is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, the University of Geneva, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution is meeting for its 5th session at the end of next month in Busan in the Republic of Korea, so in less than 1 month now. The Road to Busan event series organized as part of the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues in collaboration with various partners provides member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for the upcoming negotiation by launching new reports, new initiatives, and hosting briefings and discussions, such as the one you are attending today, for a timely outcome of this very important negotiation. Today's dialogue, organized with Greenpeace, Break Free from Plastic, and the Plastic Pollution Coalition, is launching the Champions of Change global initiative that gives companies a platform to leverage their influence and push for a strong global plastics treaty that will drastically cut plastic production. As you will hear soon, more than 350 businesses have already signed an open letter under this initiative calling on governments to cut plastic production via the treaty. Before we begin, let me remind our attendees that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available as usual on the webpage of this event, and the link is available on all the slides that will be shared today and also in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. You have a slide here showing also how to access this Q&A box. We will use your questions to feed the discussion during the Q&A session. And the transcript is also available in over 100 languages, as indicated in the current slide that will soon show on the screen. To formally welcome you and introduce you to the topic of our discussion, I am delighted to give the floor to our moderator, Sam Chetan Welsh, Senior Policy Advisor for the Plastic Free Future campaign of Greenpeace. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, for opening the session today. It is always a great pleasure to collaborate with the Geneva Environment Network. And good day, colleagues, and welcome to today's webinar, Champions of Change, Business Leaders for Plastic Production Reduction. The 5th session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, INC5, will be held in 4 weeks' time. It's coming up very, very soon, to further develop an internationally legally binding instrument on plastics pollution based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic under the UNEA 5.2 mandate. In fact, this is a very timely conversation that we're having today, given that we are expecting the next draft of the chair's non-paper imminently. Across the INC process, my experience is that member states have expressed a desire for input from businesses who will be impacted by the measures in the treaty, especially on the politically challenging issue of controls and caps and limits on the production and supply of primary plastic polymers. With that in mind, today Greenpeace, Break Free from Plastic, and the Plastic Pollution Coalition are launching Champions of Change. This global initiative gives companies a platform to leverage their influence and push for a strong global plastics treaty that will drastically cap and cut plastic production. Our goal here is to show that plastic production reduction doesn't have to come at the cost of a healthy business landscape, and is in fact an enabler of genuinely sustainable solutions. More than 350 businesses have now signed our open letter calling on governments to cut plastic production via the treaty. We're very grateful to have a list of great speakers joining us today. Firstly, we'll be hearing a more detailed introduction of the Champions of Change initiative, how and why it came about, and its relevance to the upcoming negotiations in Busan. Then we'll hear about the economic case for plastic production reduction and controls in light of an increasingly volatile market. And lastly, we'll be hearing from the signatories themselves about the initiative. Why did they sign? What is the importance of reducing plastic production to their business's future growth? As Diana said, I would strongly encourage audience members who have questions to send them in the Q&A box, and we'll endeavour to come back to them at the end of the session. And I'm looking forward to a very rich and lively discussion on this topic. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, and that will be Emma Priestland, who is Global Corporate Campaigns Coordinator at Breakthrough from Plastic. Emma will introduce the Champions of Change initiative and discuss the importance of highlighting private sector voices in favour of drastic cuts to plastic production. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Sam. Good morning and afternoon. Thank you to our host, Geneva Environment Network, our distinguished speakers, and all of our participants for joining today. My name is Emma Priestland, and as Sam said, I'm the Global Corporate Campaigns Coordinator for the Break Free from Plastic movement. Our global movement works to achieve a future free from plastic pollution. And since its launch in 2016, more than 2,000 organizations from across the world have joined. And together we work to bring about systemic change by tackling plastic pollution across the whole value chain. We are very proud to be a co-initiator of Champions of Change, together with Greenpeace and the Plastic Pollution Coalition. Next slide, please. So what are Champions of Change? They are a large and diverse group of progressive businesses who have signed an open letter calling for an ambitious and effective treaty. These business leaders recognise the harms of plastic pollution and expanding plastic production. And our Champions of Change are going further than other business voices, because not only are they calling for a cap on plastic production and a phase out of single-use plastics, they are already actively modelling the future we need to see in their business practices. These businesses are reducing plastic, they're operating reuse systems, offering products and services plastic-free, or ensuring their packaging is truly recyclable and toxic-free. Next slide, please. So over 350 companies have signed the letter, demanding 4 key things from a treaty. 1, a cap on plastic production against a historic baseline, and the setting of an annual reduction target that limits global warming to 1.5 degrees and protects biodiversity. Secondly, they're calling for a phase out of single-use plastics, starting with bans for the worst offending items such as sachets. In addition, highly problematic polymers and chemicals must be eliminated. Thirdly, they're calling for targets for reuse systems to drive the uptake at societal scales, supported by globally harmonized reuse standards and funding. And finally, these businesses are calling for a justice-focused approach that centers the rights of communities most impacted by plastic pollution and supports a just transition. And this is really the first time that businesses ranging from global multinational brands to SMEs have called for such high ambition from the treaty. And this letter sends a clear message to governments around the world that strong measures will be welcomed by the business community. Next slide, please. So as researchers find plastic in human brains, placentas, and blood, they're also learning more about the dangers of chemicals associated with plastic. But plastic is also a climate issue. It is made from fossil fuels and so contributes to the climate crisis at every stage of its life. From extraction and production to the eventual disposal by burning in incinerators and cement kilns, plastic is adding to the world's carbon footprint. And if we don't take action now with binding reduction targets, production of plastic is set to triple by 2050. A recent study by Karali et al. On the climate impact of plastic production found that current plastic production is emitting as much carbon pollution as 600 coal-fired power plants every single year. And the production of plastic is currently accounting for 5.5% of the carbon budget to restrict global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. And the researchers modelled that under a scenario with a very conservative growth in plastic production of 2.5% per year, greenhouse gas emissions will more than double by 2050, which will eventually be accounting for 21 to 26% of the remaining carbon budget. And the figure that I've shown here is taken from an analysis of the same study by Gaia. And they have modelled that to stay below 1.5 degree temperature rises, we need annual cuts in primary plastic production of at least 11.8 to 17.3%. And that is required every single year, starting from this year. It is really clear from recent research that planned growth in plastic production alone can scupper the international climate goals, and that deep cuts will be necessary to stick to 1.5 degrees warming. And as climate disasters are becoming increasingly visible, businesses know that their customers want to spend money with companies committed to reducing their impact on the climate and environment. They know that improving plastic recyclability or adding recycled content to their products is insufficient. Corporate commitment to tackling the climate change must include cutting plastic use to contribute to a global reduction in plastic production. Next slide, please. So when we look at existing corporate commitments to tackle plastic pollution, we're seeing that they've really fallen woefully short of the scale that is needed. Figures from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation annual report of the New Plastic Economy Global Commitments have revealed that big business is struggling to address the crisis on their own. Plastic use, and in particular single-use plastic packaging, is deeply ingrained in the business models of all major consumer goods companies. We can see from these figures that over 5 years, the signatories to the global commitment have only achieved 64% of packaging that could potentially be recycled or composted. Their target they're aiming for was 100%. The amount of plastic packaging that is reusable has actually decreased down to 1.2% of the total weight of plastic packaging that these companies are using. And collectively, the brands have also increased their use of virgin plastic use since the commitment was signed. So the struggle of many major brands with large research and development budgets to make any meaningful change to their plastic use really underscores the absolute urgency of globally harmonized rules with clear targets to cap plastic production. Next slide, please. And we know from research that there is a one-to-one relationship between the amount of plastic a company uses and the amount of that company's plastic products that are found in the environment. A recent paper in Scientific Advances shows that just 56 companies are responsible for over 50% of plastic pollution found in global cleanup efforts. And actually, this is really good news, because it means that binding measures to limit plastic use in consumer goods sector can have a really significant reduction in plastic pollution that is found in the environment. So while large consumer goods companies fail to adjust their business models to accommodate a low plastic future, there are many businesses around the world that are already showcasing the innovation and imagination needed to do so. And we must really uplift and support these businesses. And today we are calling on policymakers to listen to their demands for a treaty that will support them. Next slide, please. So what are the champions of change? There are over 350 businesses from 29 countries and regions. We have 2 large networks of reuse and refill businesses, and we have individual signatories, including well-known global brands, zero waste stores, suppliers of plastic-free materials, restaurants, grocery and personal care companies, and service providers. And the support of reuse businesses is especially notable, as reuse will be a key enabler that will allow us to cut single-use plastic packaging and reduce the virgin materials that we use. Without more reuse, it is unlikely that the treaty aims will be achieved. And so binding targets and measures to scale up reuse will really be needed. Next slide, please. So after all this discussion about why ambitious businesses are so key to ending plastic pollution, what do we actually want to see from the upcoming INC5 in Busan? Critically, it is of vital importance that the full mandate of the UNEA Resolution 514 is respected, even if that means that negotiations are extended. The treaty must address the whole life cycle of plastics with legally binding rules and targets to reduce virgin plastic production. The treaty must eliminate hazardous chemicals in plastics for the sake of human health and the environment, but also to enable safe and effective recycling of the plastics that we do use. And no treaty can be effective if we don't know what is going on. So harmonized and mandatory reporting will be essential. And equally, commitments to multilateral finance are needed so that there is a stable, accessible, and predictable supply of money to enable the transition to a future free from plastic pollution. And finally, the treaty must ensure a just transition for workers along the plastics life cycle, waste pickers and other informal workers and workers in cooperative settings, Indigenous peoples, and frontline or directly affected communities. And this includes financial support, official acknowledgement of their rights, transparency on the health impacts of plastic pollution across the full life cycle, and of course, full participation in policy making. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. I appreciate you attending and listening today. And of course, I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have over the Q&A or over email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for kicking us off and introducing the initiative showing businesses supporting plastic production controls. Our next speaker is Tom Zanzillo, Director of Financial Analysis at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEFA. IEFA is a non-partisan, independent think tank providing analysis examining issues related to energy markets, trends, and policies. If colleagues participating in this webinar haven't already read it, I would strongly recommend reading a number of IEFA's recent materials, including their report, Why a Production Cap Makes Financial Sense, which I believe has been a real thought leadership within the discussion within member states around the treaty space. And I believe Tom will be outlining some of the arguments made in these recent papers today. Over to you, Tom. Well, Tom, I believe you're on mute. Sorry.
Okay, is that it? Okay. Thanks for inviting me, and good morning and good afternoon and good evening, I assume, to some. And thanks for having me. My organization has been doing a considerable amount of work on the petrochemical markets globally. And we were asked to think through some of the concepts related to a production cap or some kind of production intervention. And I want to just start out with one point that is implicit in what Emma said. Rather than these kinds of market interventions that we're proposing impairing profitability, I think we have a very strong case to make that it will improve profitability. And so keep that in mind as we go forward, so that we get a pretty good idea. The message is pretty simple. The process is complicated. The message is that the industry is currently facing a system where they've overbuilt. So there's an oversupply of plastics, and including the single-use plastics in the world. And there is there are plans effectively in most countries to continue growing as if it could be fed, and that's unlikely. And I'll go through, why that's not going to occur, and why, absent a cap, we're going to wind up with lower profits for sure, and of course more of the same in terms of the environmental health and climate impacts that we all are aware of. So next slide, please. I'll go through this relatively quickly. Talk a little bit about why we're in favor of a price cap from a finance and economic point of view, and what the oversupply means, and how the markets are looking at that, and then why we see the petrochemical industry going through what we're calling a secular decline, and how the kind of production caps we're talking about are important contributions to how markets are going to need to reform. Next slide, please. So the price cap, as I said, we're seeing oversupply, and we're seeing a continued plan to build out. We focus a lot on ethylene here, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the markets are failing to balance, and you'll see why. And they're failing to balance pretty clearly. Where this is not a maybe case. This is a pretty clearly defined set of issues. And no cap, continued pollution, and problems with emissions. Next slide, please. So we're looking at ethylene, which is a core commodity, and it's central to most of the plastics and petrochemical development in the world. What this little chart shows you those blue lines are production capacity. That's globally, all countries, all regions, and you see the line going up. The red line is utilization, which is what percentage of that capacity is being used. You can see that line going down through 2030. A healthy market is probably upwards in the high 88 percentile range, and you see it's going down into the high 70s, low 80s, and this is global. And so ethylene is multi-sectoral. It's a sort of it's a bellwether measure that you can use. And it is clearly pointing to an oversupply and a continuation of that with a continuation of capacity. That's why those blue lines are going up every year. Next slide, please. This is just to try to show you a little bit about how the various single-use plastics, including ethylene in its part, as part of this, central production processes. And what you see is all of them, basically, the utilization rates are going down, which means evidence of an oversupply. Some are kicking up a little bit, but they're not returning to those healthier levels that they had in the past. That oversupply, next slide, please, is occurring for several reasons. One, the economy has slowed down. During the last couple of decades, the Chinese economy, which drives much of the petrochemical business in the world, production and consumption, was in the area. The gross domestic product was growing at a rate sometimes in double digits, but always in the high single digits. As you can see here, the dotted black line was the estimate last year of the Chinese economy, and now we're looking at the solid black line, which is still slower still. And it's going to be, here they have it around 3%, and I think that's what most markets are thinking about through 2050. A 3% growth rate in China is unheard of, but it is going to be the future. And part of the reason for the oversupply is that the build out has been predicated on a 8, 9, 10% GDP growth. So they already have it baked in, and there's an overcapacity, and it's showing itself worldwide. You could see the other numbers for the rest of the world, etc. Next slide, please. The other thing to take into account, and this is something implicit in what Emma said, is that the sustainable market process and the energy transition is well underway. There's 3 major sectors that the fossil fuel industry sells to: power, transport, and petrochemicals. In all 3 of those areas, we're seeing historic competition that the industry had never seen before. In transport, we know we see the rise in electric vehicles. That's going to continue. There's hundreds of billions of dollars behind that market. In the US, on the power side, for instance, there are no new coal plants being proposed. Natural gas plants are being cut down in size. Right now, our wind and solar markets are going to build at 10 times the rate of natural gas. And that's just the US. It's happening pretty much more or less in most parts of the world. Next slide, please. But the most important thing that we're focused on here is the petrochemical markets. I took methanol just because it's one. And in each of the fundamental areas where methanol is used, formaldehyde, MTBE, acetic acid, and gasoline blending, in every one of those areas, there's competition. So there's a trimming down. Sustainability is now taking over market share. So you have a slow growth economy, and you have now a diminished market share. Next slide, please. And when I spoke about China before, this is a population graph. The top purple images are China, and the slender nature of it in the 2050 to 2100, that's an older, poorer population. So there's an enormous capacity. They're overbuilt, and the domestic market, a younger, growing market, is decreasing. That's going to be happening for the next 60 years. That's not going to be able to be turned around. It's the biggest market in the world for petrochemicals. And so you have India and the US growing at a healthier kind of a market perspective. So you'll have slower absorption of what is the largest capacity for petrochemicals in the world, which is in China. Slower markets, competition from sustainability, poor older population. Next slide, please. Trade patterns that are being disrupted. Put it bluntly, the current world is moving into a bipolar arrangement with the US and on one side and the European allies on the other, and the Chinese and their surrounding markets on the other. That bipolar arrangement, as it crystallizes, will have more and more smaller market for China to try to move their now surplus petrochemicals out into the market. And there are also problems within their own power block that'll cause them problems. So the geopolitical changes are disrupting traditional markets where companies would build and be prepared to move into. So the trade relationships are now upset. Next slide. It's not just us, that the IEFA is talking about this. In fact, we're probably one of the least important sources. Standard & Poor's has made it clear in a case in Louisiana showing the Formosa company building a petrochemical plant. It has concluded that that petrochemical plant is not needed. It will harm its credit rating, Formosa's credit rating. But the most important thing for this particular body, it says it is global. There are political forces, but more importantly, they point out that there are market forces, the same market forces I'm talking about here, that are preventing petrochemicals from moving forward as a sector. Don't listen to me. These people rate $73 trillion in debt. Moody's has basically done the same kind of analytics, not as specific to petrochemicals, but very clear that that's the issue. The other thing that's now a new part of the market is citizen opposition. The work of Greenpeace and others is very clear, and this particular treaty discussion is a very important impact on the markets. And the markets are faced with precisely the problems that we're talking about. Last slide, please. So we're seeing as a cap a way, along with other reforms that might be you might put together, is all the plastics you need, but only the plastics that you need. And that's kind of the way that we're approaching it. Without it, you're going to have this dynamic, slow growth. You're going to have sustainability taking up the markets. You're going to have a population change in China that's going to drive the world's economics in many ways. And you're having a more disruptive trade patterns. Those four things are what we call secular decline, because they are factors beyond the control of the markets to police. And that's why we're in favor of this kind of intervention. And we think it can be very successful. We've also produced some charts in a fairly substantial database that you can consult as you're doing your deliberations. It's linked to the letter, the paper that we wrote. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. Very insightful and a lot of food for thought from your analysis. I now want to introduce our next speaker, Seth Laxman, who is advocacy and activism campaigner at the cosmetics company Lush, who are one of our signatories to the Champions of Change. Lush has been innovating packaging-free solutions and can provide real-life insight on the challenges created by current levels of production in virgin plastic. Over to you, Seth.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Seth Laxman. I use he, him pronouns, talking to you from Lenni Lenape land in Philadelphia today. So, just a little intro for folks who don't know Lush. We are the ones who make, the bath bombs, shampoo bars, other cosmetics products for your bath, lotions, all of those great things. We're super excited and proud to be part of this coalition since the business was started. Focus on sustainability and packaging has been both like a happy accident and a central part of the business strategy. So I think it's important to mention globally, we have this great climate and nature to-do list. One of the 5 pillars is making our materials regenerative and circular. So this has been, an intentional part of the strategy for nearly 50 years. Last fiscal year, about 47% of the all year round product range could be taken home without any packaging. And then 57% of all products, so that includes like holiday ranges, limited edition products, 57% of those were sold totally naked, right? So no packaging whatsoever. That's certainly the business's priority, right? There's a lot of work to, that we'll talk about in the next question is like reuse and our Bring It Back program. But for us, going naked with the products, right? No plastic, no anything, is both a money and a planet saving solution. The start of it was when the business was first getting off the ground. There was very little money to spend on packaging. So it was a way to problem solve that. And then it created this great sort of, store planning model, right? Creating this spectacle. If you've not been in a shop, there's all these brightly colored products. They've got nothing, hiding them, and they speak for themselves in that way. Displaying those products kind of like a grocery store, like a fruit stand. A lot of the displays look like that. It also gives us this great opportunity to educate our customers on this concept of using less or no packaging, making it interesting, making it fun. We spend a lot of time training our staff in the stores to be informed on selling a product to let the customer know how to use it themselves, right? Instead of relying on packaging for directions or the benefits of the product. Our staff do that in their face-to-face interactions. The other side of it, right, is, for example, the shampoo bar, which our founders invented in 1987. They've been around for a long time now, but most people have never heard of, a solid shampoo bar alternative. Folks don't really understand how to use them. They're so used to liquid, shampoos, conditioners, all of that. But it's just as good of a product, right, as a liquid version. It also saves our customers money, right? Selling it in this solid form with no packaging. We're in an industry where often the packaging costs more than the product to make. The other side is assuming a shampoo bar, you can use it, up to 60 washes is generally our estimate. I love them. I use them. I've had one that, has lasted over 6 months, whereas, liquid version, you might need to be really spending more money on that. So it's, you're saving the equivalent of 3 200 milliliter bottles. Since 2005, these shampoo bars have saved the use of nearly 170 million plastic bottles from going to landfill. That's, estimated to be over 4,000 tons of plastic avoided, like through this naked model. I think, just to talk briefly about one of the challenges that I think is quite interesting in this approach is the formulation of the products, right? So it has to be microbiologically stable enough to go without the packaging. So you have to invest into that, R&D and that really careful, invention process so that it's a good product to use, right? It has to stay looking nice, right? It has to be as good of, if not a better product than the conventional form, right? It has to be high quality. If not, we're both hurting ourselves as a business and in general, the movement to move away from, single-use packaging, because if a customer doesn't like it, they'll throw it away and they won't buy it again, and they'll be turned off, to that whole sort of option for them if it's not a good value for their money. So, given that the beauty industry is set to contribute 120 billion units of packaging to waste this year, most of this is fossil fuel derived plastic. We, are really proud to be part of this movement to encourage all businesses to support a strong, ambitious, and binding global plastics treaty. We think that companies taking these steps, oh, my 5 minutes is up. Sorry, Sybil. I'll just say, we're glad. We think that everybody should be involved in this next chapter, especially businesses on the front line of, these sorts of innovations.
Great, thank you, Seth. I mean, if there's anything you wanted to conclude, just you're very welcome. I can give you the floor for another few minutes. I think we have the time, or are you happy there?
I think that's great, unless you all wanted me to touch on the Bring It Back program. I thought that was in the second question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, no, we'll come back to that. That's perfect. Thank you so much for your insight. So in which case, I will move on to our next speaker, Natasha Chawla, who's the Hong Kong director of Muse, who are another signatory to Champions of Change and another practitioner in this space. Muse provides reusable cup and container systems in 4 markets: Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the USA, and have proven success in packaging reduction. Their data shows 450,000 single-use items diverted from landfill and a 98% return rate. Again, we have a real-life example here of a successful reuse business, and Natasha can talk about the key successes and challenges and why they signed up to Champions of Change. Over to you, Natasha. Oh, I think you're on mute, Natasha, sorry.
Sorry, thanks, Sam. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people joining from across time zones. And thank you, Geneva Environment Network, for inviting Muse to this Champions of Change global webinar today. I mean, it is preceding something that the whole world's waiting the outcome of the INC5 meeting next month. I'm Natasha, I'm the director of Muse in Hong Kong. Muse is a smart platform for reusable packaging. Our system is suitable basically for any kind of reusable packaging, but we currently operate in B2B food and beverage space. So essentially cups and food boxes. We're currently operating in 4 geographies across North America and APAC: Singapore, Hong Kong in Asia Pacific, and Canada and US. Within Canada, it's just Toronto at the moment, and in the US, we are operating in California. Now, some of the successes I'd like to touch upon. Now, in all these 4 geographies, we're working on very, very different reuse models. But at the heart of all of these models is the end user's convenience. We understand, I mean, people, all of us are used to, or we've got habits of convenience of using disposables. So just shifting the culture is not easy. Therefore, that's kept at the heart of it. And how we do that is wherever we're doing this reusable, it's free for the end user. They can borrow any reusable in the system for 30 days. If they do not return after 30 days, then we charge them a recovery fee for the unreturned reusable. We call it penalty model, but if you look at it, they're literally just buying that product. And we use very high quality coffee cups. They are double-walled steel cups, which a lot of people would come and tell me in the events that, well, this looks really nice, I'm not returning it. And we go, okay, no problem, keep it, because you basically pay for it. So it's penalty / I buy the product. I'd like to highlight some of the successes. I think we have kind of created a proof of concept that the reuse economy is a possibility. I'd start with Hong Kong market. In the Hong Kong market, we work in two models. One is what we call business districts / malls or hub centers. Now, our clients would essentially be the developers, the owners of buildings within the business district or high street fashion malls. So in all of these places, we would basically contract with the developers. And with those developers, we would basically work with the food and beverage stores within these portfolios. And we would stock reusables in all of these stores. and also manage the reverse logistics. So it is quite simple, although there's significant logistics at the back of it, but it's, people come, scan to borrow the reusable, and there's a network of, in any of the building complexes, let's say there would be 10, 12 return bins, which are smart return bins. So basically they can scan their reusable and drop it in the bin. And that gets returned on their system. It reflects immediately. So it gives them the comfort that it's done from their side. And then we manage in the back that, all of those bins are empty, taken to the washing facility, and then brought back and restocked at the restaurants. The second successful, if you, let me paint a picture. If you pivot it and make it citywide, which is what our vision is, it's exactly what we want. That would save so much plastic going to the landfill, and reuse of economy is a possibility. We've proven that. Now, we've done that even at a city level. At the moment, we have a very, very exciting project running in Petaluma. It's a small town in the state of California. This is a public-private partnership project, which is running from August to November, and all eyes are on that project for the success of it, the return rate, and so on. So that is a no penalty, no deposit, free citywide model. The whole city, there are 30 restaurants that are participating, and there are 60 return bins across the city, which have been, planted. So people can just go. Literally, it's the experience is quite similar to the disposable experience. So I, as a user, would just go ask for my coffee or food, whatever. I would be given my drink in a reusable, and then I just take it. I can drop it wherever. I have 30 days to return it. So from the user's point of view, there is no scanning required either to borrow or to return. Now, this is, of course, a test which is being done, and we are just waiting. About after the end of November, we would know what's the return rate like, what's the economic model looking like. This is done by City of Petaluma and NextGen Consortium. So you can imagine, all the competing, for example, Coke and Pepsi are in the consortium, and those are competitors, but they've come together to test this model because reuse is the future of this world if we want to save it. We're really looking forward to what's coming from the treaty, and we really want some of the plastic materials to go out from there. I think another very important success that I'd like to highlight here is that we work in closed visitor economy, what we call. So in the closed economy, for example, think of a Disneyland that every store would have used reusables, and the whole of Disneyland would have the return stations or return bins. Now, we could either have return bins which are smart return bins where you scan and drop, or it would be just go to drop without scanning. So we've got all of that. One of the examples is in the Banff National Park in Canada near Toronto. That's where it's working really well. So all the residents as well as visitors could borrow. It's called Banff Borrows, the program, and that is also supported by the municipality. So we're working with independent companies, we're working with governments, and we're also working with global chains. So one other example I'd like to highlight for successes is we're working with Starbucks in Hong Kong. So Starbucks is managed by Starbucks. We've given them the technology. So these are a few models which are working well. I'd wrap up, my time's up, but I would like to highlight one big challenge, and I think that's where the government intervention is very important. I'd summarize the challenge. If we want to scale reuse economy, which we've seen success in, I'd say that single-use packaging has been scaled and optimized for many, many years to such a degree that it's very hard to compete with such a market dominance. So that's the biggest challenge in making this a reality at scale. The people who use packaging or the vendors who develop, they don't have to deal with the problem. it's the governments or the building owners that have to deal with the waste afterwards. So there's a motivation issue here. And also makes it harder to make the change because this is a systemic change required and not just the products. I think I'd stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And yeah, that final comment is very, very interesting and very relevant to the ongoing discussion in the treaty space about the role of producers and producer responsibility, and how does the polluter pay in this context. Yeah, very, very, very useful contribution. Thank you so much. Our final speaker is Fernando Rodriguez Mata, the Director General of the New European Reuse Alliance, another signatory of Champions of Change. New Era is also the name for this organization. New Era is an association of 70 reuse businesses from across Europe, which provide detailed recommendations to policymakers for how to scale up reuse schemes. Thank you, Fernando. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sam. Hi, everyone. Indeed, today in Europe, we are feeling a revamp, a revolution of reuse businesses across the whole continent, mainly in France and Germany. And that's because that's where we have, let's say, policy in place that is pushing for reuse, which is showing how important it is that we get some international recognition of reuse, hopefully next month in the Global Plastic Treaty. So over the next 5 minutes, I wanted to quickly present New Era and how we are working and advocating to make reuse the norm in Europe, but also obviously at the international stage. So next slide, please. New Era today is a trade organization representing very ambitious reuse businesses that provide solutions on many different sectors, and they provide different activities. Reuse is different to the linear single-use packaging economy. We are providing different high-skill activities and also jobs. We expect that only in Europe, the reuse industry will create up to 600,000 jobs. And this is because we are bringing in different set of skills and activities into this new value chain. We will see it in a moment, packaging, design, manufacturing, but also collection, washing, certification, and so on. We are an umbrella organization. We represent 70 businesses from 12 countries, but within our members, we also have national and sectoral associations. In total, we account over 700 companies today in Europe, and we believe there are around almost already 1,000 companies in Europe, that are pushing for a more resource-efficient and sustainable economy. Today, we face a reality in Europe, which is single-use packaging, as everywhere in the world, is massively adopted. As it's been said, reuse accounts for 1-2%. So there's definitely a huge margin for growth in this sector. We are coordinating efforts with different like-minded organizations to push for reuse. Today in Europe, we have soon to be adopted regulation, the packaging and packaging waste regulation, where we have been working on over the last 2 years since we started, actually 2 years ago. And finally, we've got some interesting measures, not as much as ambitious as we would have liked to see, but already in this regulation, we have mandatory targets for reusable packaging in transport and beverage packaging, and other measures that we believe are important, starting with a common terminology and a minimum number of requirements, which is something that we would like also to see at the Global Plastic Treaty. And also important to say that we are material agnostic organization. Regardless of the material the reusable packaging is made, we believe it's important not to focus on the material itself, but the use, from single use to reuse. Obviously, depending on the case and the context, some materials perform better and make more sense economically and environmentally speaking than others. Next, please. So just to catch up on our vision and mission, we want to see a wall of packaging and ecosystem that is reusable, convenient, and sustainable for all. We believe that reuse is not the silver bullet, as some other industry and organizations said, we agree on that, but for sure 1-2% is very, very low, and recycling has proven not to be enough. There's too much packaging waste being produced. All in Europe, we produce almost 200 kilos of packaging waste per year as an average of citizen, and we can just not recycle our waste out of it. So what we are trying to achieve with our network is to get the policies right in place that will unlock the potential of well-designed reuse systems, which hopefully will, if well-designed, as we are advocating for and we are working with our members, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, will reduce also material consumption drastically, and also that's something that is usually debated, will cut down water consumption as well, because the water used in the manufacturing of packaging, of single-use packaging, usually accounts for the largest part of the water that is used in the process, whereas for washing reusable packaging, now the technologies that we are using here in Europe are very efficient in a way. So reuse makes sense in many cases from an environmental standpoint, and the main issue we have here is to build the economic case, and for that we need clear and robust financial incentives. Today, everywhere in Europe and elsewhere, the single-use packaging is not reflecting the real cost. It is externalizing part of the end-of-life management of that, collection, recycling. In many cities across Europe, taxpayers are feeding in or through direct taxes or internalizing the local budgets a lot of resources for the collection of single-use packaging, and this needs to be reflected. Today, reuse systems are paying and bearing the full cost of the systems, whereas single-use packaging is externalizing part of this. So we are advocating with also ambitious municipalities in Europe that we already see. For example, in Aarhus, the second largest city in Denmark, we have larger scale system for food and beverage service packaging with over 40 collection points, and a majority of the restaurants that have adopted reusable packaging for food and beverage. And this is what we want to see in the future. But still, we need to build, as I said, the economic case to scale up. Next slide, please. So just to reflect the variety of sectors and activities that our members provide, reusable packaging is everywhere. Reuse systems can be found in hospitality, restaurants, events, and all kind of sport and leisure events. For e-commerce as well, which is an increasing source of packaging waste as sales keep rising. Retail, for sure, that's also one of the major sectors where packaging waste is produced, and today we are developing systems for many different fast and moving consumer goods. And last but not least, transport and industry. That's actually where there's more widespread reuse solutions today available in the market. That's because the economics work in many cases, like for the pallets or plastic crates. And in the business to consumer scenario, we need to reflect the real cost of single use to also build the economic case for reuse. And in terms of activities, we have, you can see here, manufacturing, design, labeling, which is very important to ensure traceability and safety of the packaging, new technologies regarding software and the collection to make it also convenient. As Natasha previously said, we need to build sustainable systems from an economic environment point of view, but that are hopefully as convenient as single use at least. So next slide, please. Our members are spanning from all these sectors, washing, different reusable packaging options, mainly in France and Germany, as I said, because those are the countries where today we have policy in place. Hopefully in 2030, when the PPWR, the packaging and packaging waste regulation, becomes adopted, we will see everywhere in Europe. And with the Global Plastic Treaty hopefully being adopted and recognizing reuse, we will also see it everywhere in the world. and that will be good for the planet, good for the people as well, but good also for the companies, because well-designed reuse systems will bring in economic value and growth, and also create local jobs that are not depending from international value chains, because reuse is a local solution, and we need to tackle this global problem with these companies that are pushing the way and showing us where we need to go. So happy to discuss it later with you, all the questions, and thank you for the invitation again.
Thank you so much, Fernando, and it's great to hear optimism about the reuse revolution. I think the amount of job potential in reuse is often under-discussed. I remember speaking to a colleague who outlined how a single-use cup means removing a load of job potential growth in collection, sorting, washing, etc. So yeah, very useful to have your perspective. And I want to move into our Q&A portion. So just to flag to participants, unfortunately, Seth from Lush had to leave us. We were going to have a brief discussion about the Lush take-back schemes and the challenges of establishing schemes to improve recycled content in light of overproduction of virgin plastic. So I'll move to a question for Emma. Recently, the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty released a joint letter from CEOs to heads of state calling for binding rules in a global plastics treaty. I think many participants will be wondering, what is the relationship between Champions of Change and the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty?
Thank you, Sam. I mean, first of all, the Business Coalition, we are deeply grateful for their coordination, working together. And within the treaty space, it's been incredibly beneficial to have major users of plastic showing up in that space and advocating for harmonized and binding rules. I think a difference here between Champions of Change and the Business Coalition is really that Champions of Change are calling for a cap on plastic production very clearly as the very first thing that they're asking for. They're talking about reduction targets that are focused on ensuring that we can stick to a global warming of 1.5 degrees. They're calling for a phase out of single-use plastics, including bans. And this is something that the Business Coalition has hinted at, but often shied away from. And obviously, you know, they're a coalition of enormous companies where their entire business model is focused on single-use plastic. So that does make their messaging sometimes a little challenging. And we see this in the recent letter from CEOs. While it's an enormously powerful intervention, and it will be something that a lot of what global governments will be listening to, they do fail to talk about a reduction in the production of plastic. And the letter is primarily focused around binding rules, around harmonizing EPR standards, and of course also phasing out chemicals. So yeah, this is the difference. I think we have an enormous amount of increased ambition with Champions of Change. And potentially this comes from the scale of businesses that we're working with. We find that, you know, smaller startups are often a lot more agile. They don't have these enormous pressures of the global financial system, of their shareholders bearing down on them and forcing them to prioritize increased profit over all else. And we know that, you know, moving to reuse can seem like a very daunting project for a lot of companies. And while the startup costs may be a little bit higher, overall, you know, you're not having to produce plastic. So this is a really positive thing for a company, and it can result in reduced costs. So we've seen with, you know, the voluntary commitments that the Business Coalition companies have been making, that while they were ambitious to begin with, they have failed to make any meaningful changes in their own business models. Whereas our Champions of Change are already making those changes. They have built their companies off of the basis of being environmentally friendly. So that is the key difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. A very useful intervention. A question directly for Tom, because I think, yeah, your insights and analysis was extremely valuable. And as I say, I think is very, very different to how many people conceive of future growth perspectives for the plastics industry. In informal dialogue with member states from producing countries, I think personally what I tend to hear is two typical responses. So the first one I would say is an expectation that overcapacity and overproduction are it's a temporary phenomenon. Demand will bounce back. Look at the example of what happened, for example, with renewable technologies like solar panels. And then I think there's another track of responses that I receive, which is, okay, well, fine, we might well be reducing demand in the use in packaging, particularly single use, but of course it's going to massively increase in other sectors, for example, automotive or in house building. I'm really curious to hear what your perspective is on this view, if you don't mind. Oh, sorry, Tom, I think you're on mute. Apologies.
The issue of cyclical absorption, which is really what you're talking about, and that historically that's not inaccurate. That the markets, the measure that I was talking about, the utilization rate, when it's high, that means profits are probably pretty good, but it also is a signal that maybe they need to add new capacity, and then the tendency is then to overbuild, and then the markets come around and absorb the overbuild, because the way growth is taking place is exactly that. Growth is tied directly to the petrochemical absorption, and the entire fossil fuel sector is based on moving at some multiple of GDP growth. And what we're looking at, what I was trying to show, is that the GDP growth is likely to remain relatively low for the most economic indicators are through 2050, right? So the next few cycles are going to be muted in terms of what they're planning on and what they're planning and what they haven't, been planning on for the last few decades. We're seeing, and just as my little experience in the U.S. is, there are more cancellations and delays on these projects than we've ever seen. That's one phenomenon, and that's something that's outside their control and different from normal cyclical movements. The other thing is the sustainability markets. I mean, you just presented hundreds of businesses that are moving into the sector. They will not all succeed, they will not all fail, but they will do one thing: they will shave points off of the markets of traditional development of plastics. You don't need to end plastics production in order to impact the market share of the companies. So you could, if you're looking at growth and you're tying your new production to growth, a single half point of growth reduction is going to probably impact your profits much more than that. So the market sustainability, you can't just look at it from plastics, because it's plastics and oil and gas. And so if you look at all three of the sectors that the oil and gas industry play to, petro, transport, and power generation, they're all being hit with historically unprecedented forms of competition. That's how I would answer the second point. The third point is, you can't argue with the fact that China is the largest producer of petrochemicals. It's overproduced now. The population changes that are going on are happening now. The numbers are going down now. The import and export problems are happening now. They're not going to change. That's a demographic destiny. It's baked in for the next maybe 50 to 100 years. So that's going to change that dynamic one way or another. So I concur that the historic processes, if left to their own devices, would produce the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And the way in which all of these businesses are seeing the same thing, and they're saying there's room for us in the marketplace. And you know what? They're right. So, and the second point, I'll try to do this more quickly, is that there will be other uses. That's right. And there are going to be other uses for fossil fuels. I think if you look at what the IEA said, if we're successful in implementing COP you're probably still going to have a marketplace with 10 to 20% of fossil fuel use, most of which will be petrochemicals. And I don't disagree with that. The question which I put at the end of my presentation is, yeah, all the plastics we need, and only the plastics we need. As innovation occurs, it will reduce that which is not desirable for the markets. And so right now, you're right, electronics, definitely, automotive, definitely. Is that going to stay that way forever? Probably not. It may, but the overall market is shrinking like this. And the industry, both petrochemical and oil and gas, need to prepare for a declining market, producing for fewer people is the best way to put it.
Thank you. Very, very useful insight. And I think for member states on this call, I think that links both to the question of supply, but also to the discussion about demand within the treaty and the concept of what we are debating about what is an avoidable plastic product, what counts as essential use criteria, what do we really need going forward, and what is being produced in order to inflate demand to prop up the fossil fuel sector, or at least that's the perspective that Greenpeace would have, certainly. Thank you, Tom. I want to ask our reuse practitioners. So Tom described the benefits to markets of a production cap. What could be the benefits to your businesses of a cap and/or reduction in virgin plastic production? Do you think this kind of control, a cap or targets, which we assume will address the market imbalance that currently favors virgin plastic, would that help make reuse systems more cost competitive with single use? What do you think would be the impact? I'll open that to Natasha or Fernando, either of you. I'd love to hear if either of you have thoughts on that. Oh, Natasha, sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, this is ridiculous. Okay, I think more importantly, they've got to be rules around use of reuse than curtailing the plastic production, because some of the reuse products will still be plastic, but more durable plastic, right? Like PP, a durable PP which is recyclable. We'll still continue using that. So I think regulatory intervention is more around stop using single-use cups, stop using that's where I think that'll have a better impact than just we can't get rid of plastics, I think.
Fernando, do you have a perspective on that?
Yes, so I mostly agree with Natasha. I think that a cap on plastic production, if well implemented, should reduce the amount of plastics put in circulation, even though the forecast is that plastic production is going to keep increasing if we don't do anything. So at the end of the day, if we can, regardless of the material, at the end, reusable packaging, be it in this case plastic, stays in the loop more and more, it will be more cost competitive, indeed, reusable packaging than virgin plastic, where there may be less offer and therefore demand and price may rise, which indeed may help reuse systems to scale up and grow in the future. We, beyond that, need as well to have clear, key measures to make efficient reuse and refill, take back obligation, incentives to get high return rates, because one thing that would be dramatic is that we put reusable packaging, which typically brings in more material to make it more durable, but at the end we don't get the return rates back. So systems like the one Muse with a penalty system is working very well to get over 95% return rates, and that's what we need. But also we need targets, as the Champions of Initiative letter is saying. We need targets to really push all these big companies to get into reuse. We are seeing now the conversation in Europe keep increasing, because now the companies are facing what this is going to mean in 5 years. We need to also raise awareness with consumers. Consumers, unfortunately, today have been, been used to for at least 3 or 4 decades to single-use packaging, and they need to understand, how the new systems work. What are also the the advantages of using these systems. So we need a lot of both staff training, but also campaigns to consumers. And last but not least, indeed, the polluter pays principle, as it was said before. We are seeing now in Europe some cases where EPR schemes are paying for the development of reuse systems. To cite an example, France, the EPR systems responsible for household packaging waste are now obliged to invest at least 5% of the budget to support reuse. So, for example, Citeo, which is the EPR in France, will pay this year 100 million euros into reuse schemes, and this is helping advance our industry. And this is what we need to see. Rather than, we are talking about EPR now within the Global Plastic Treaty, we cannot make the same mistakes as we did in Europe, which was, okay, now kind of the industry is fine with paying, the EPR scheme. Now let's hope that these non-profit organizations representing industry manage to collect and recycle packaging. No, that's what we should avoid in other countries where we don't have still EPR schemes developed, and we should look and learn from the mistakes we made in Europe to avoid this.
Great, thank you, Fernando. I want to highlight some of the questions from the chat because I think they're very, very interesting. The first one is a question from Natasha. In this business model, did you see any difference of customer behavior between the countries Muse is based in? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because, of course, you have markets in Asia, and a lot of the conversation around reuse has been focused more in Europe, but we know there's actually definitely personally, we have a really, really interesting and exciting coalition of reuse practitioners in Asia and Southeast Asia. So yeah, I would love to know if you have some insight there, Natasha.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a great question. So I'm not sure which model this is referring to, but I can broadly respond to that consumer behavior more or less across these very, very different geographies is quite similar. If you make it convenient, if you make it visible, if you force it, like if there is no disposable option available, they will use it. I would also like to highlight something very interesting. Like I live in Hong Kong, and this city is quite risk averse, and people would wear masks normally. Even now, when COVID's well behind us. During the COVID period, Muse was continuing operations and it did well. So the thing is that there are some greenies out there that will continue. And if, for example, in Canada, we do festivals and, farmers markets. It's quite, this is the only difference I'd highlight in different regions, countries, that in some places, rewards don't really impact the uptake. I think our Western practices don't need rewards to uptake or to adopt reusables, but in Asia, that's a thing, right? If you do 50 cents off on coffee, which we do for literally everywhere we have our reusables, in all the cafes, there is a percentage discount or a dollar discount. The adoption's better with discounts, but in the West, that's not the case.
Great,
so
thank you. Yeah, that's very useful. Thank you. And I would highlight participants. I would draw the attention of participants to the fact that the treaty, including at INC 5, but certainly beyond, will be diving, I think, very deeply into discussions about global standards on reuse, and for Greenpeace and Breakthrough from Plastic, the question, and for UERA and others, the question of targets is a very, very fundamental one, and supplementing targets with things, mechanisms to deliver the targets, like deposit return schemes, clear take back schemes. And so, yeah, that will be a very, very live conversation in the years to come. So thank you, Natasha. A very interesting question from the chat, and a very fair question. How do you foresee individuals in developing countries who rely on plastic packaging to enable clean water and safe food access being affected by production caps? Would you consider these plastic packaging applications as essential? I'll open this to the panel actually, because I think a number of you will have interesting insights. You know, I know, Emma, that Breakthrough works a lot in developing countries and has this question a lot, but yeah, anyone who would like to answer, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can definitely kick off the discussion. Thank you. And thank you for that question. I think it is obviously really critical. We like to look at global systems, from a systemic point of view. And we don't think that we will ever tackle this problem just by snapping our fingers and removing a product. You have to look at the whole reasons why that product existed. And if it is the only access to clean water is via plastic bottles, then the clear answer is how do we provide clean water to people without relying on plastic bottles? And this could be one of the key areas of the finance that needs to come from the treaty, is enabling systems to grow that ensures people's access to the necessities of life, safe and clean and a healthy environment that isn't reliant on plastic. And the more that we learn about the chemicals that are associated with plastic, that are often leaching from plastic products and packaging into people's, the things that are contained within, the more that we understand that really, plastic packaging itself is not safe in many cases. It is so much better to have a systemic look at these things. How can we ensure safe access without relying on plastic? And we have this conversation coming up a lot within the healthcare sector as well. And actually, there's an enormous coalition of healthcare practitioners that have come together to say that they also want to see reductions in plastic and rules that will ensure that plastic is no longer necessary within the healthcare sector, because they understand that the health impacts of plastic that we are just learning to really, really uncovering now, are so severe that it is much better to try and avoid it from that system. So yeah, it is not, there's no simplistic answer to this. And that's why this treaty is so important, that it has a justice-focused approach and it has clear mechanisms for financing solutions to move away from single-use plastics. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Would anyone else like to contribute to that point or add there?
Yeah.
Yeah, Tom, please.
Yeah, you're right about this the systemic our preoccupation with systems. We've been involved in different places. We're currently involved a lot in Puerto Rico, where the impossible obstacles regarding the provision of electricity there, which go on all day. But we've been able to start neighborhood-based rooftop solar installations. And at first we didn't think, it's too small, it isn't going to work, blah, blah, blah. And with the systems that people pour, and we started making it available, and it's now hitting into like 8 or 9% of the grid system is now taken over just by neighborhood folks putting together their panels and putting together community stuff. But at the household level, this is germane. We have systems that can produce 3/4 of the normal electricity in Puerto Rico, which in the U.S. So, for instance, just 400 kilowatt hours a day is what a month. I'm sorry, is what the families use in Puerto Rico. In the U.S., it's like 1,200 for a normal household. So you can see it's already a third. And so from America, say, my boy, we're only going to be able to provide 300 kilowatt hours, through the solar. This is not going to be particularly useful, except when we started to put them in and people started to tell us how they've redesigned their households to be able to use and live completely on 300 kilowatt hours of electricity, including one family was telling us that mama lives with them and she's sick and she needs medical attention, various machines, a lot of single-use plastics in the packaging of the things. They've just decided that it's a priority for mama, and so a lot of things get boiled, a lot of things get done, and they work with medical professionals there in the community to sort of work. It's what that household set as a priority, given a meager resource to me is a meager resource. To them, it's a godsend, 300 kilowatt hours of electricity. And I just said to myself, people, if they're giving constraints and all, and it works, and they make it work because it's their families and homes. I would like to have much better systems. I would like to have this is done. Solar energy in those communities is not done for environmental. It's not done for pollution. It's not even done for economics, although it is a little cheaper. It's done for survival, And when that is put in place, you have a different, and you guys have a different way of doing things. It's not the systemic solution, but it's an understanding that when you release a systemic change, it creates other kinds of changes, some good, some not so good.
Great, thank you, Tom. That was very useful. Well, this has been a very rich discussion. I think, looking at the time, I think I'd like to leave the panelists the chance to make any final comments. So to guide that, I think I'll ask one more question, maybe, given that we're 4 weeks out from INC5 of the Plastics Treaty process. Emma already introduced this concept, but I'm really interested in what the panelists are hoping to see coming out of INC5 specifically, both to address the production and supply of plastic, but also on any other obligations that you see as critical. We've heard a bit about the importance of the treaty for reuse. Yeah, anyone who'd like to kick us off, what would you like to see coming out of INC5, and any other closing remarks that you'd like to make to summarize from our discussion?
I can go ahead if.
Yeah, please, Fernando, go for it.
Thank you,
The
Sam.
floor is yours.
Great. So, well, absolutely. I mean, we are coming at the crossroads after, fourth sessions of negotiations. We are all hoping to see an ambitious agreement being reached in Busan in 1 month. I must say that from our perspective, reuse needs to be recognized at the treaty. At least, have the definition in there of reuse, what reuse systems are, and also, a minimum set of requirements, because we want to do this right, and reuse needs to be well defined and well established to pave the way for the future. For sure, these measures, capping production, phasing out problematic single-use plastics, are also needed to help us scale reuse. And we believe these are important, yet at the same time we understand the difficulty to get an agreement with these measures. So, there's discussions whether it's better to wait maybe for a 6th session and get more ambitious text. At the end of the day, I think it will be very difficult in the current global context to have the 100% countries at the UN level to get on an agreement. So we need to have as many ambitious member states possible to sign on an ambitious text and go ahead. And at the end, if 90% of the world is moving on that direction, the demand and the market dynamics will change. So we need hopefully this reuse recognized with some measures, as I said, harmonized terminology to avoid confusion at international level, and clear requirements when it comes to durability, labeling aspects, design considerations, safety as well, and a minimum number of rotations to ensure that reuse is robust, and we can, maybe in the future keep adding with different council of partners, put maybe mandatory targets and so on in the future. But at least for Busan, why not to have these reuse and minimum requirements in there?
Great, thank you, Fernando. Any other colleagues want to wrap up with their expectations and hopes from INC5?
Yeah, I just had
please.
Well, one is that I would fully expect that the arguments I'm making around markets and interventions will be rejected. Not that it's wrong, just that it's kind of difficult. But one of the things that can be understood, and it's something that I think has been true of every one of the speakers, is that if a a rule can get established, a consensus, almost any rule, moving towards progress, you can make it work. It's almost like the markets and the governments and our role, understanding that we can move incrementally. We don't have a lot of time, I know, but any agreement like that is going to be valuable because it's going to confirm the vision and maybe not move far enough towards it, but move us towards it. And the second thing that I would say is that the countries, and I was, when you, Sam, when you were saying, you know, the two questions that you had, I would have thought you said, you were going to say to me, well, but our government loses revenue and we may have unemployment if we do these kinds of steps. And so we have to really adjust that. And I think there are answers to that question. And I'd be more than willing to help people. I'm a former controller for a fairly sizable government in New York, which also meant dealing with little small places. And I'm also doing a lot of work now around the world. There are answers to those questions, and they're honest questions. And they're not, you know, industry baked in fake, you know, questions to send us off into the wrong place. Those, I think, are relatively honest questions. And so that's hard to separate out when you're in the middle of negotiation, what that is and what isn't. But anyway, I hope maybe that's what I'll tell you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. And yes, that is you're right. That is another very, very common reply from the member states. And so I think you're right. There are absolutely quite clear answers to that, and whether that's around, again, finance, producer responsibility, global rules, and what that can do to a market, the certainty, removing volatility. All these points are really important for us to understand as the discussion evolves. Emma, do you have any final contributions?
Yes, thank you, Sam. I mean, my main aim, my main hope is that, you know, governments step up, that they are strong and that they are resisting the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry. We have a human right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. And that does not just mean, you know, plastic litter that we can all see. Plastic is polluting at every single step of its life cycle. From the moment that those fossil fuels are extracted, frontline communities are suffering from devastating harms and health impacts from that production of plastic. And that goes all the way through to, you know, lack of fertility that people are experiencing potentially from chemicals associated with plastic, to the communities that are living next to landfills, next to incinerators, next to cement kilns that are burning plastic. Like, people are suffering from plastic pollution all across the world at every level. And that is before we even start looking at the devastating impacts of climate change that we've already discussed that plastic is a huge part of. So I want the governments in Busan to show strength, to really step up, to commit to reducing plastic production, and to take as long as it needs for them to do that. I do not want us to leave Busan with a treaty that is just a shell and spend the next decades trying to fill in the gaps and strengthen it, because we have seen how that works in the climate space. And we really have an amazing opportunity now to, you know, really tackle this issue. And this, you know, plastic covers so many other issues. It's so interlinked with so many other things. So I hope that the governments listen to us, and I hope that they see that, you know, business is already leading the way. We already have so many of the solutions that we need to reduce our usage of plastic. So that is my hope. I will have my fingers crossed.
Excellent. And Natasha, I just want to offer you the floor in case you have any final remarks before we conclude.
I was just writing on the chat box saying, I echo Emma. This is exactly, I mean, she's articulated it so perfectly. The time is really now. The governments really need to stand up and take an action, come out with a proper treaty and not just, greenwashing. And I really hope reuse is a significant part of the treaty, because that is the future. I mean, how else do you get rid of packaging, right? I mean, everything, all products need to have a container, so we can't get rid of it. So reuse is really a simple yet very powerful solution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Natasha. Well, I'm going to wrap up there. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for their contributions. The picture being painted today is that current levels of plastic production are a threat to the opportunities in new, genuinely sustainable business models, and that the Global Plastics Treaty is a major opportunity to bring what could be a very volatile market under control, while also meeting our climate and environmental objectives. I think with that, we can conclude. Thank you again to our panelists, to you, our participants, and to the Geneva Environment Network for being our hosts. And back to you, Diana, to conclude.
Thank you very much, Sam. We would also like to thank you for your great moderation. Thank you indeed to all the panelists, but also to all the attendees who were with us today and those who will be watching later the video of this event, because we were in concurrence with other webinars targeting also participants or people involved in this important negotiation. I just wanted to flag here that we have a few other events in on the road to Busan that are already scheduled. 2 are taking place next week, as you can see on this slide. And a few more events are here that are not related to plastics, but we also invite you to join us at those events. You can find all the information on our website as usual, and my colleague is sharing the links in the chat, and also bringing to your attention that we are indeed, as I'm talking here, also discussing with the other stakeholders and partners and member states preparation of other webinars that are not yet on the screen, but with the World Health Organization, with our friends of IPEN and others, we have a few more things coming up. So we will reach out to our audience, but stay tuned and visit regularly our website. And just remember here what was written in the chat, that the letter, the open letter of this initiative that 300 businesses have already signed, calling on governments to cut plastic production via the treaty, is still open for signature. And the link has been shared by Emma and by other colleagues in the chat. So feel free to have a look. And with that, thank you all for joining us today, and looking forward to have you on board at upcoming events. And to all those traveling to Busan and involved in this important negotiation, best wishes for a timely and also good outcome of that negotiation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.